And we will be discussing a topic that has so much resonance every day for women and birthing people of color. So the conversation will be from that lens today. We are honored to be joined by two content experts working on the AIM CCI project, which we will say more about in a moment. Next slide, please. But before we do that, I'd like to go through a few logistics. So there are two ways to listen to your audio: through your computer or through your telephone. All participants will be muted during the conversation today. And as you saw, the webinar will be recorded. Please add your questions or comments in the chat as well. And we may not have time for Q&A, but we will be gathering questions and following up with participants who registered today. Next slide. So I'd like to first introduce our panel. We have with us today Deidre McDaniel, who is president and founder of Health Equity Resources and Strategies, or HERS. And she's also the clinical community bundle integration specialist with the AIM CCI project. And we are delighted to have her today moderating as well as participating in this conversation. Next slide, please. And we are also honored to have Dr. Fleda Mask Jackson, who is president of Majaica, and I should have asked you, Dr. Jackson, how to pronounce that, which is a national research firm, think tank, and leader of Save 100 Babies, and AIM CCI subject matter expert. And I should also say pioneer in this field. So we are especially honored to have both Deidre and Dr. Jackson here with us today. And I would like to also say that though the title of this presentation is 5 Ways Racism Impacts Maternal Mental Health, we know that there are certainly many more things that impact, and this conversation will surely touch on those things. Next slide, please. So before we get into the conversation, we'd like to take a moment of silence for the victims and families and communities of Uvalde, Buffalo, and all communities impacted by gun and any other violence. And we're leaving that moment of silence, leaving this comment here shared today on social media for some thought and reflection. So let's just take a few moments to remember. Thank you, everyone. Next slide. So at this point, I'd like to hand this off to Deidre to start the conversation with why we're even having this conversation today, the racial disparities in maternal health. Deidre?
Thank you so much, Alicia. Thank you so much to everyone who's in attendance today, especially in light of all of the things that's going on in the world. I thank you for the moment of silence to sort of reflect on what's happening and hope that we can just take a collective breath before we talk again about some of the more terrible things that are going on as it relates to maternal mortality and racism. So just as a point of transition to sort of center the conversation around what the actual topic matter is, maternal mortality rates began to double in the 1980s. However, what this slide actually demonstrates is that we're 35 years into the work of reducing maternal mortality rates, but the rates for Black women continue to rise. The National Healthy Start Association has been on the front lines advocating and supporting women in the community for decades. And we're here today to highlight the work of one of their newer programs, the Alliance for Innovation on Maternal Health Community Care Initiative, or AIM CCI. And what the AIM CCI program is actively doing is addressing disparate rates in maternal deaths by focusing on equity in maternal and mental health. Next slide, Amber. AIM CCI was awarded, or National Healthy Start Association was awarded a 5-year cooperative agreement from HRSA in 2019 to pilot the AIM CCI program. It's focused on improving maternal health outcomes through using maternal safety bundles in non-hospital and outpatient clinical settings across the US. Currently, it's being piloted in communities with the highest rates of maternal morbidity and mortality. And the National Healthy Start Association is partnering with pilot sites and community stakeholder individuals and organizations identified as the local maternal safety work groups. By leveraging the voices, knowledge, and reach of community organizations, we seek to address and overcome systemic inequities that lead to poor maternal health outcomes. And one of the voices that we are leveraging today to discuss the ways in which racism impacts maternal mental health is from one of my mentors, although I haven't officially told her she's my mentor, the dynamic Dr. Fleda Mask Jackson. Dr. Jackson, it is an honor and a privilege to share this virtual stage with you today. And without further ado, I'd like to jump right in and get started. So just to get us started with the general overview and question, Dr. Jackson, your work is at the intersection of mental health and maternal health. What do you feel are some parallels in the challenges that women and birthing persons encounter in these two spaces?
Well, when you're talking about mental health and maternal health and what is going on, you know, it's a really huge thing to bring another life into the world. It's both what is happening in terms of the person carrying a baby, carrying a new life, and what their expectations, hopes, and dreams are for that new life. And so while there's much going on for these individuals, one who's being formed and one who is part of the formation of this new person, there's so many things in the environment that are going on that it really can affect the way we see ourselves, how we function in the world, and how we project the future. So these two things definitely come together. And while we spend a good bit of time on the physical well-being during pregnancy, we have to give a good bit of attention on the mental health and well-being during pregnancy as well. So I am delighted that we are at this juncture that we're giving more attention to it. Unfortunately, we're giving a lot of attention to mental health in general because of what we've just gone through and are still continuing to go through it because of the pandemic. And the pandemic, not only because of disease, but the pandemic of violence. And so we are at this point that we recognize that we have to attend to this. It is a vital component of the health and well-being of giving birth at this time and at this time in our country.
That's a very good point. And from what you're saying, especially about what we're currently seeing and the constant traumatization, whether you're in the communities or if you're watching this on the news, how do you think that affects stress levels? Because I know that stress has detrimental effects on our physical health, definitely has detrimental effects on our pregnant and parenting moms, even when you think about the future and what that looks like for potential children to come, for children that you currently have. So what is some of the role of stress in all of this in terms of parenting and gestating as a woman?
You know, everyone has stress. Although I have often said that it is something that is certainly part of our modern era. I can say as a child of the 50s and 60s, I heard women talking about worried or worryation or something, but not stress. Stress was not something, it wasn't as used as often in the vocabulary as it is now. And so it's very much a product of what we have now. Now, stress is something that we all have. It's like holding a glass of water. If you hold the glass of water for too long, if you hold it for a little while, you'll feel it. But if you hold it for a long time, it'll start hurting your arm and then it'll go up to your shoulder and it will create a lot of pain. So everybody has that. But we are now in a situation where we have layers and layers and layers upon stress. So stress is really an impediment to what our goals and objectives are for our lives. Those could be everyday objectives like going from one point to another and the traffic is heavy and you can't get there, to things to wanting to get a job and being concerned about whether or not you'll be treated seriously as a candidate for that job, to things that happen in your household. Certainly, as I think about women now who are stressed about how they're going to feed their children, very serious in terms of the formula shortage. So stress is a full range of things, but it's not just things that happen to us in our minds from a psychological standpoint. It's really doing some things to our bodies. It starts in the amygdala, and as it moves through a physiological process, it creates cortisol levels, which if they are never reduced, they can lead to serious chronic diseases, diabetes, heart disease, hypertension, and so forth. So this is a very, very serious matter. And we're at a juncture now that we talk about it, but, and I will say that some things are being done about it, but I think it needs to be more fully integrated into part of the prescriptions for better health for us, and particularly during the pregnancy and postpartum time. We really have to give more attention in a way that's as serious as giving medication, as you know, and so, and I will say there are things that are happening now, but we have to have more and more of that, particularly at this era and the time that we live in right now.
Yeah. I know that a lot of women are going through having a lot of anxiety right now, like you say, anxiety, depression. But what I'm finding in my work, at least in the maternal health space, is that there's a fear of discussing these things that might be going on, whether it's depression, anxiety, some of the ways in which you're coping with the stressors that you're experiencing due to structural racism, or basically, like you said, looking for formula, all of those things. Mm-hmm. And one of the terms that I've come across is racialized pregnancy stigma, and having to work harder to not have to be confronted with stigma and bias by doing extra work, like making yourself more presentable, or when you go to doctor's visits, making sure that if you're married, you wear your ring, all of these different things. But what it's done is, as opposed to created a space where it opens dialogue to what actually is going on, it sort of stunts the process to promote healing. Would you say that there are additional ways in which racism or structural racism, or how we have to shift and morph and code switch, affects our mental health? Would you say there are additional ways in which can then lead to the health of the pregnancy?
I thank you for introducing that code switch, because that is an important kind of way. This duality, as Du Bois talked about, the dual identity that we carry with us. And as expectant mothers, as expectant parents, we are now fighting for our lives and the lives of the children that we carry. So we want the best for them, but to have to switch and be someone else in a situation where you really should be able to reveal all about yourself, because revealing all about yourself is what will lead to the remedy of whatever situations that you may find yourself in. So certainly within the healthcare arena, where racism is a problem, racism in terms of not having full access to all the things that are available, medications, social support, social services, any numbers of things that are not available. But racism in the communities where we live, and racism represents discrimination based on race, injustice based on race, and defining race in some very specific societal ways that go back to the beginnings of the history of this country and moving forward. And so what we find now is that the stress from racism, from not being able to get the things that you have, during the pandemic, it's been interesting to me as we talked about access to food. And there's a difference from one grocery store to another that's part of the same chain, depending on what the neighborhood is. And so I can only imagine for mothers who are seeking formula, what it has been like, depending on the neighborhood that they were in, whether the additional shortage of formula for those babies. So it's those kinds of things. It's things about what is going on in your neighborhood in terms of resources for you and the children you already have, or the children that you're expecting to have. So in the COVID era, in our COVID dilemma, we have seen that children didn't have access to Wi-Fi neighborhood. So one, they could not go to the schools they attended. And two, if they were doing at home education, could they have access? And did they have access to all the machinery? So those are kinds of things that happen within the neighborhood that you're in. Three, the racism and stress affects us in terms of the protection of children. While we're carrying them in the womb, we want them to be protected. When they're born, we want them to be protected. And so here lately, as we've seen yesterday with the shooting of those children, and I don't care who you are, I live in a neighborhood where I'm on the board of my neighborhood school, and my children have long gone from the neighborhood. But I kept thinking, what would my principal do had that happen in that school for those elementary school children? And what will be the decisions? As one parent said, she doesn't know whether she will have her child return to that school. So now there's an issue for the child she has, and if she has future children, the children that she will have. So it is protection of children, lack of resources, infrastructure within the community, interpersonal racism as a stressor. So that those interactions outside of your community always have this questioning and guessing and what have you. And I would argue for the Buffalo shootings, I have to admit, I am more suspect of who doesn't look like the people in my community who enters the store. That's really at an interpersonal level, because they may well be innocent, but now I don't know. I simply don't know. And as someone who is of a certain age, I see myself as more vulnerable in situations that I never thought about before. So it's all of these things that make up the particular stressors that I call gendered racism. Gendered racism that embodies the overlay of what are the expectations or what we embrace in our roles as women, as gendered individuals, and as it intersects with race. And what does it mean, therefore, to be a parent and a mother of a child? And what the expectations, and those expectations are thwarted because of racism, because you don't have the right school. You have to ride out of your neighborhood to get certain kinds of things. You are concerned about the curriculum for your children. You know, there's been so much emphasis now about the 16, 19 and other populations have said, no, you're not going to teach my children. But what are our children taught? You know, are they to sit in a classroom and slavery is the only thing that's taught about Black people? Or are there other things that are elevated as well? These are real critical issues that we face right now. And they have certainly come to the forefront in this particular time.
You know, as I was preparing for today's discussion, I was looking at information about hypervigilance. And when you talk about gendered racism in terms of how most parents they're vigilant over making sure that their children have what they need. But the way gendered racism or racism plays a part as it relates to people of color is because we become hyper vigilant, not just because we want to make sure our children are getting what they need, but we have the added stressor of racism. We have the added stressor of, like you were stating, the woman with her children in school. Is this going to now be a safe alternative for them to go? If my son leaves the house, you know, is he going to come home? Or my son, my husband, my brother, are they going to come home due to police violence? So it's all of these things that are being reintroduced and re-traumatized, and it becomes intergenerational. So do you feel that there are effects? And I know there are theories out there like post-traumatic slave disorder, intergenerational trauma. Do you feel that those have a place in this discussion and impact the physical dynamics that we have going on while pregnant, but also the mental health that we deal with as well, and dealing with those intergenerational traumas and stressors?
Absolutely. If we understand the process of how stress has a physiological impact on pregnancy. There are indications that it actually stunts the growth in utero, which can lead to prematurity. So we are not guessing around that. We know that there's a pathway to which that happens. We know that stress is certainly implicated in levels of hypertension, or that trauma is there, in cardiovascular disease. One of the things, and this is a long-term proposition. Some years ago, I did some research looking at individuals between 17 and 19 years of age. And so there's a youth survey that the CDC does. And interesting enough, we saw indications of pre-hypertension, pre-diabetes at a higher rate among African-American teens. Now that tells us that something is going on there. Does that go all the way back to birth? Perhaps, because there's some indicate, you use the word hypervigilance, and that there's this whole notion that there may be a hyper reactivity because of the stress, because of the anxiety, because of all of these psycho-emotional responses that are happening during pregnancy, that may, in fact, put our babies at risk of developing, by the time late teens, signs of pre-diabetes, signs of pre-hypertension, signs of conditions that when they manifest themselves during pregnancy, they create a soup of risk for not only for the pregnancy outcomes, but for the mother herself. And so there's a definite relationship between that physiological stress response as well as the chronic conditions. Now, we definitely know that there's a relationship between those exposures and the responses. And let me back up a little bit, because we talk about stress mainly as stressors, those things that are impediments to what we want in our lives, whether, as I said before, whether it's getting from point A to point B, and there's so many traffic and what have you, to things that really prevent us from getting the things that we want for the quality of our lives. Okay, so one of the things that we do know, though, is those stressors over and over and over again, we try as human beings to remedy those. We try to mitigate those. And so we apply our ways of coping, a way of reacting to it. But so often what we have is inadequate for the level of stress that we have. And so the question I always raise in my work and in other work is, what is the remedy for the stress from racism? Particularly if it's at a structural level. Now, I may have some things that I do, and I certainly support and advance mindfulness, meditation, and those things that we put in that big bucket of what we call self-care. But they cannot remedy structural racism. You know, that requires another level of intervention that's beyond the individual. Yes, there are things that we have to advance, support, develop at the individual level. But then there are other things that are so far out. So for instance, and you appreciate this as someone who is an expert in the social work arena, case management is always said as one of the approaches. So a woman doesn't have a home, and you know, homelessness is a problem for pregnant people, pregnant women. It really is, for various reasons. Well, where are we case managing this individual to get a home? Is a place that will have long-term stability? Maybe not. It does not resolve the issue of housing that is unaffordable. That's a structural issue.
Gentrification.
Gentrification. all of those things, and all of those things are in the mix. So we always have to have a dual path of what is the immediate that an individual, if they need mental health support because they are depressed and need to work through what they can do, they can go so far. But then there's definitely a cap on how far they can go to remedy the problem. So yes, we really do have to move into that mental health space in some very serious ways. And you, Deidre, mentioned this whole issue of trauma. And, we talk about levels of stress. There's chronic stress, which happens every day in all of our lives. We have chronic stress. There's acute stress. Mm-hmm. There's stress that's it's just a jolt. Although for some people, acute stress is chronic stress. Because if a lot of people die all the time, that happens regularly in your life. If you find yourself having to move 5 or 6 times during a year, then that's moving into a chronic space. And then there's this trauma, this major bolt, something that we really don't expect. And so, but unfortunately, those things happen simultaneously. It's not, okay, everything's going along and then we have, no, those things are happening simultaneously. And for Black people, for Black women, for Black people, it really is a real contributor to the soup of toxicity that puts both mother and baby in jeopardy, in serious jeopardy.
Yeah. When you spoke about, we had a conversation the other day where you talked about what's the clinical intervention for structural racism. And I on my desk, I always have Post-its of things that I need to continue to evoke thought. And that's been resonating with me for so long since we've discussed it, because you're very right. We might have modalities that can deal with interpersonal stressors or things that are going on. But when you have structures that people are being confronted with on a regular basis that are presenting barriers daily to just standard of living and daily activities of life, what is the clinical intervention of that? And in therapy or in the therapeutic session or setting, we talk about interpersonal trauma and how that can be felt as betrayal or loss. We try to articulate that. But as it relates to structural trauma due to structural racism, it really is a sense of being let down or from organization in society, or represents the failure of systems to protect, to protect people of color from harm. So when you're confronted with that on a daily basis, it becomes very difficult as a practitioner of color, but as a practitioner in general, to try to come up with resources, case management, different ways to try to help people navigate just daily activities that sometimes you get bogged down with not even really talking about or being able to get to the crux of what it is, because it's so monumental that one person or one individual can't make a dent to dismantle a system that's been basically causing harm for centuries. And so with that being said, what do you think, in addition to that, what are some additional challenges that women or birthing people of color are facing to accessing mental health care during pregnancy in particular? You mentioned homelessness. I also know that in terms of, and I'm not even just talking about during pregnancy, we talk about preterm birth and low infant birth weight and mortality, infant mortality. As a NICU social worker, I was always confronted with families in need and the stress of being in the NICU, the stress of the treatment modalities and their beliefs from what they believe versus alternatives to what the clinicians believe. So the challenges in trying to address what was going on, even in after the baby is going, and the stress or depression you might have, or the guilt in trying to get them to services. There's always, they say there's a lack of care. There's a lack of affordable care, although we have insurance programs that are supposed to remedy this. Then we need more physicians or practitioners of color. How do we go about addressing some of these different challenges in a way that's impactful? Because they're daily, they're continuous, and they seem to be long-term. And no matter what we're doing, it becomes very cumbersome, and it's only small chips at what's going on. So we can name the challenges, but then how do we go about addressing them?
Well, I thank you for, recognizing the short-term and this long-range effort that we have to put in place. Now, I'm going to be more positive in the sense that because I have witnessed some things over the last 20 years, the issue of not having people of color, I think is being addressed in terms, I mean, it's not resolved.
No. But
it is being addressed. And so I am delighted now as I see these different groups, and particularly taking advantage of the technology for the counseling, for those ways in which individuals can give voice to their distress, to their depression, to the things that they need. So while there's so much to be done, I will still, based on my observations, say that we have made some progress in that regard. It's a lot to be done. So it's a hell of a lot to be done. But we are better off than we were because of the full range of providers that are in the mix now and who have the cultural resonance with those individuals most being impacted, but also understand some of the modalities for doing it and are quiet as kept adapting those modalities. And that's why it becomes important for us to have ways in which this kind of work that's happening on the ground is documented, is assessed, is replicated. We need that. We really do need that. We need ways of screening that that is particular to the kinds of stressors and distress and whatever interventions are applied so that we see what works and doesn't work. And I actually do see that in its genesis. I will say in its genesis now. The growth of providers is amazing to me. I know here in Atlanta, I'm just kind of keeping an ear. Who's out here? And because we've had so much attention to the disparity in maternal mortality, I'm seeing those family counselors who did family counseling, family and marriage counseling, begin to have a component of their practice which deals with maternal mental health. Again, it's just at the genesis, but I'm hopeful there. And if for anybody out there listening, you know, have at it, because we need you. As some states have adapted 12-month Medicaid expansion, my question is, what will be in that expansion? And we still, as we work, as you and I work with AIM CCI, what will be in that expansion? And in the mental health space, it must be resonant to the particular stressors, the general stressors that any individual experiences, but to the particular stressors that we know that women of color are encountering and which are devastating for them and their babies. So I will say, but I appreciate, Deidre, your recognition that in some ways, those doing case management are in a hard spot. They're in a hard spot because you got to take care of the immediate need.
Yes.
You got to take care of the immediate need. This is not time to have an intellectual dialogue about the system. Is I need a place to stay.
Right.
I need clothing and I need education. I need food. I need transportation. I need these things to be addressed today, knowing full well that a year later, we'll be back at this talking about this again, because that was a temporary fix.
Yeah. And to your point, some of the work that we are doing with AIM CCI is creating or helping communities create infrastructures to sustain more long-term these efforts. So for example, the work that we did as a committee on the maternal mental health bundle, where we are developing, you know, practices and tools that can be used in the community that bring up all of these points, you know, making sure we're engaging individuals most impacted by these rates of maternal mortality or these adverse rates in maternal mental health. You know, people of color are more likely to exhibit and express more severe issues with depression than their white counterparts. And it goes that way in terms of every single diagnosis. There's people of color having more difficult time in addressing those issues and accessing resources. So with that bundle and with the work with the bundle, what is one of the most things that you are proudest of that you were able to include as a resource or as one of those elements that you think are nuanced in terms of making sure that we address the equity pieces and the collaboration pieces and the continuity of care moving forward?
Well, I think you said it, and that is to make sure that there's a recognition that there are some very specific lived experiences among African American women that have to be incorporated in that clinical care. It is just unconscionable now in light of the recent shootings. And I'm talking about Buffalo specifically, but I am also talking about Texas as well. To not acknowledge that someone presenting themselves for clinical care, that there will not be some effect on them in that care. Yeah. That there will not be some worry, anxiety. And anxiety is certainly something that's rather typical during pregnancy, understandably, because individuals will have the responsibility for a new life of which they may not have any experience and may not have the supports that they need to care for this new baby. But now with other things and the dangers that's out in the world, it becomes just critical that be recognized as one of the risk factors for however this individual is presenting themselves. Whether that becomes part of an intake form or what have you, and that providers be able and willing to address it. And there are different ways that can be addressed. You know, in Healthy Start, I've had the pleasure of working with Baltimore Healthy Start and their belly buddies. And many of the Healthy Starts do have these groups with the individuals whom they serve. And that gives them the opportunity to give voice to those things. That is critical for them to give voice. In Baltimore, when things went awry with Freddie Gray, they had belly buddies to come together and to talk with one another as the riots were taking place. That becomes critical. And so I think I'm proud that has been brought to the forefront. And also proud that I think it gives the opportunity for the sites to determine what fits best for them. It does. I think what's generalizable is that it should happen. The specificity of how it happens, in large part, will depend on the setting and what the needs and the resources. And I think also the elevating this as an essential component of the care during pregnancy. That yes, we going to take your blood pressure, and yes, we're going to make sure that those targets and milestones in terms of what should take place, but that we also now become more accountable for what takes place in that mental health space. So what we have now, where it takes place, is depression screening does among Healthy Start sites, but it's not universal. Right. And I think to be part of something that would push it to be universal, as New York City and New York State have pushed forward, and to find out how do we close the loop so it's not just a referral and forget it. That's my goal. That it's not, if someone presents themselves with hypertension, the screening, the assessment is done, It's on the chart. They have hypertension. There's a follow-up and everybody's involved because we know preeclampsia and other things that what the risk. It should be the same thing for mental health and depression and stress. Yeah. So that there is something that is a follow through on that. I'm happiest that this is an opportunity to utilize our home health care workers, our doulas, those who really have close contact during pregnancy, so that they are more keenly aware of those mental health and perhaps will have more training so that they become the go-between. As they are the go-between for the physical health, why not for the mental health? Yeah. Because they will see the manifestations of depression. They will know when their client is unable to function, when their homes look untoward, when the children are not being cared for as they may have once been. They will be their first line to see that. And so that is my hope, that just as those physical manifestations of things that may represent risk for mother and baby, that those psychological manifestations will also be given attention. And some of it is, because the space that loneliness is a real health issue. I read somewhere the other day that loneliness was equivalent to smoking, I forget how many cigarettes, in terms of being a risk factor. And some of this, so those individuals who are in the home may represent one of the antidotes for loneliness to some extent. But through the creation of the things that Healthy Start and other entities do, it also addresses that as well. We really going to have to deal with loneliness as a health issue. We deal with it on the elderly end. We're not necessarily dealing with it on the someone was at my house doing some work. We don't necessarily deal with it in the way that we should in terms of pregnancy and birth, because loneliness is an issue. It is an issue. I remember some years ago doing interviews with physicians, and they talked about how when teen mothers and you know, in the teen pregnancy space, we have done an incredible job as a nation in terms of reducing those rates. But they shared with me the fact that when teen mothers would come for their visits, there'd be an auntie, a sister, somebody else would be with them. That rarely did a teen come by themselves. If there were this professional single woman who came, she oftentimes came by herself and gave birth by herself. And that was stunning to me. But I thought about it in terms of, if, for instance, she is one of a few in her group who has given birth, she's lost her running people, those people who ran with her. She's in another space. And so this issue, and I thought about this in this time of COVID and shut down and individuals can't visit and what have you. And while the technology has helped it, it's not the full solution in terms of what we talk about, skin to skin with infants. Yeah. We need hand to hand with people. Okay.
One of my favorite parts about working with AIM CCI and creating these bundles is that we're sort of pulling people out of these silos.
Yes.
We're in essence forcing everyone to sort of work together. And I think COVID, in a sense, when we have situations where you're called to do things differently, where you're called for innovation, you sort of don't even think about silos anymore. You think about the urgency of getting things done. Mm-hmm. And one of the nuances and great things about the AIM CCI bundles is that everything that you spoke about, all of the things that we've discussed throughout this time frame that we've been here today, every single bundle crosses all of these things.
Yes.
And the thing about it is, you know, we talk about the maternal health space and the mental health space over here, but yes, in a maternal health assessment, we always talked about postpartum depression. We yes, always did the PHQ-9, whether it was racially appropriate or not. Yes. But then when it comes to the care, we separate again.
Yes.
So in essence, what we were practicing was collaboration, but then we moved out of that once she's no longer pregnant to, okay, well, if it's a mental health issue, you're over here.
Right.
And so what AIM CCI does in the bundles is that every single bundle where there is postpartum bundle, we bring up those aspects of mental health, because I don't particularly think that pregnancy and mental health are separate.
No.
I believe mental health is a component of everybody's life, whether you're pregnant or not, but definitely in the pregnancy space, you always need to be checking in with mom about how she's doing before, during, and after. And that's sort of the way we merge all of these things together. So even if you pick up a bundle on a particular topic like mental health or postpartum, the transition to postpartum care or wellness, we haven't landed on a full name. So but in the postpartum period, the postpartum spectrum continuum, we bring up all of these things. Equity is in everything, making sure people are thinking about things differently and being cognizant of the racial ramifications that people are going through, making sure clinicians are being trained. We have that racial equity learning series, the REL series, that organizations are being trained to be attuned. And it may not cause a change in heart, but at least makes you be attuned and aware to ask an additional question. If she scored fine on the PHQ-9, she may not have depression, but what are some of the stressors she's going through? We've all heard about what's going on in the news. So I argue that clinicians and sisters, brothers, everyone on the call, check in with someone, ask an additional question in your practice and in your home life about what's going on. That's just one easy step. And then when we bring in all of the different organizations to the table who have been looking at each issue with one particular lens, it gives opportunity to have these types of discussions where you go back and look at, well, housing is coming at it from this perspective, but then as a social worker, I can say real time, well, women are telling me that they're experiencing housing issues and they're pregnant and they're being denied at shelters because of this. So then you can start, again, having information being filtered up from the community and from the persons most impacted by these efforts that we're trying to do. And that's the model of AIM CCI. That's not only what we're preaching, but we're practicing as well. So I think it nicely ties in all of the ways in which, when we talk about the name of this discussion is 5 ways racism impacts mental health. And I think we've noticed during today that there's more than 5 ways. There can be 5 ways. 5 million ways. If you didn't walk away with anything from this discussion today, there's more than 5 ways. We did the 5 ways to bring you in, but you're leaving with the understanding, hopefully, that there's more than 5 ways in which racism impacts everything. It impacts every single aspect of our lives. Whether you're a person of color or not, it impacts every aspect of our lives. So therefore, no one is exempt in terms of trying to address it, in terms of working on it. No one is exempt from trying to dismantle this system in which we've created. And I think because you talked about being positive, I think that's the part that gives me hope, is that anytime I'm forward facing or in front of people, I always let them know you are not exempt. It may not specifically happen to you, but either it happened to you or you're perpetuating it or your complacency continues it, but it impacts every one of us. So we all have a role in making sure that whatever space you work in, whatever ways you work, that you're cognizant of the things that are the underbelly of this society and how it's impacting others, even if it's not impacting, even if you think it's not impacting you directly.
Well, and thank you, that comprehensive, because it really is an all hands on deck proposition. All hands have to be on deck, because someone in the chat asked about how often are these assessments done? Are they done just once, one and done? And unfortunately, that for some, but it should not be. It should be more than one and done. And the other thing is, the screening assessments may not really pick up everything that's culturally relevant. So the manifestation of who Black women are, and I don't want the whole notion of the strong Black woman is something that is really quite complex. It's complex, and so it is not something that we should put down, but it's also something that we really need to look at as well. And so what I will say is that some of the ways of screening don't pick up the manifestations of depression.
Mm-hmm.
So depression may manifest itself in anger and not in a malaise that we think about as depression.
That's right.
And it is those individuals who surround an individual during pregnancy who will recognize those changes, those personality changes that may signal the need for the psychosocial care that is warranted. And I think that becomes important because, again, the way we manifest it, it may not necessarily fit all the criteria that's on the form. And I've seen that, you know, Black women are going to look good no matter what. Now we're going to put it together. And
That's
so
right.
we're going to put it together. But honestly, there may be some psychological issues going on that everybody is shocked and surprised at. Well, there's a culture of representation of self that we have, which is not going to fit this other. And when it does fit it, then we need to really be all hands on deck.
Yeah.
But because it does not manifest itself in terms of malaise or unkept or some other kinds of way, we have to be aware of it and always check in. Always check in to see what is really, really going on. Then we're not shocked when we have these extreme cases of suicide and other things, because individuals say, but you know, she had it all together, she da-da-da-da-da. But there were things that were going on and there was really no way to really check in. And we've got to have a routine way of checking in.
Most definitely. Well, Dr. Jackson, I know we're coming up on the end of this session. I think Alicia has some closing statements or remarks. I could sit and talk to you about this and everything all day.
But this has been a wonderful conversation.
Yes. They did put some parameters on us because we can keep going, and we might after this session, after the recording stops.
Oh.
So Alicia, I will turn it back to you. And again, Dr. Jackson, thank you so much. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you both, Deidre and Dr. Jackson. This has been such an inspiring and motivating conversation for all of us doing this work. So as Deidre said, I know I could sit here and listen for a few more hours. So thank you so much. I thank everyone for joining us this afternoon. There were a few questions in the chat. I believe Dr. Jackson answered one of them, but we will look through those and share some of those responses in our communication with you after the event. So be looking out for a survey, a recording, and follow up on a few questions that were in the chat. And I also want to invite you to, if you're not following NHSA on social media, please do so. All of our socials are on the screen. And if you also notice, we have on my background, Deidre mentioned the Racial Equity Learning Series. So if you have not begun to explore that series, please check that out. The website is behind me and it's also on the slide, aimcci.org. So thank you again, everyone. And we will be connecting with you soon. Have a great